مساء الخير، أهلا ومرحبا بكم وحلقة جديدة من وول ستريت. موضوع الشرق الأوسط والاضطرابات وعدم الاستقرار في عدد كبير من دول الشرق الأوسط وعدد كبير من الدول المهمة في الشرق الأوسط هي الموضوع السائد عالميا، وهو الموضوع الذي سيؤثر على الحياة السياسية والاقتصادية للعالم كله. ينضم إلي من واشنطن السيد ستيوارت ايزنستات، شريك في كوفينغتون اند بيرلينغ. السفير ايزنستات كان يشغل عدة مناصب هامة في عدة إدارات أمريكية. على رأس تلك المناصب نائب وزير المالية في الفترة من 1999 إلى 2001، مساعد وزير الخارجية للاقتصاد والأعمال والزراعة من 97 إلى 99، وسفير الولايات المتحدة للاتحاد الأوروبي من 93 إلى 96. Ambassador Eizenstat, let's start with what's going on in Libya now. Do you have any view, or do you expect an end for that, and what is the probabilities?
I think the President and the administration have taken the appropriate steps now. They've made it clear that there needs to be an end to violence. They've made it clear that they support the opposition. They've made it clear that it's time for Colonel Gaddafi to leave. They've implemented very tough sanctions backed by the UN, and they've gotten the European Union to do likewise. In fact, one of the positions I held was Deputy Secretary of the Treasury in the Clinton administration, and the Treasury has frozen the Gaddafi family assets, and it appears that those and other state-owned assets are in the amount of $30 billion, and that's half the total gross domestic product of the country. So I think that will be effective. They'll try to get Swiss banks and others to cut down on any avenues to transfer funds and to freeze funds belonging to the colonel and his sons. So I think that a whole host of things have been put into effect. Now, none of those are going to immediately stop the fighting, but I think that there'll be so much pressure on Gaddafi that it will certainly weaken him, and hopefully it will allow the opposition to advance into Tripoli and ultimately to topple his regime.
But how do you think the sanctions can be effective? I will talk about as an example. Do you believe that sanctions against Iran is effective now? We see Iranian is doing the same, and they don't care about the sanctions.
Well, first of all, I think the sanctions against Iran have been effective. They've greatly weakened the economy. They've isolated Iran. They've increased the cost of shipping to and from Iran. And I think they've led to some internal dissent about their program. But the ones exacted against Gaddafi are more significant in some respects because they actually have led to freezing a tremendous number of assets. It will make it more difficult to get any currency reserves into Libya to replenish their arms and ammunition. There's a complete embargo on any arms or munitions going in. So I think that while this is not going to unfortunately stop the fighting overnight, it will end up turning the tables and weakening the Gaddafi regime and hopefully strengthening the opposition. Sanctions are never a clear solution. They're part of a solution, and I think that short of military action, which I don't think at this point is called for by the U.S. or NATO, I think over time will have an effect and will strengthen the opposition and weaken the Gaddafi forces.
There is unrest now in many Middle East countries, in Libya, was in Egypt, in Bahrain, in Yemen. Do you think the reasons behind the unrest in each country are the same reasons?
That's a very good question. Clearly, the revolt and revolutions in Tunisia spread to Egypt, and then with Egypt they've spread to Bahrain and Yemen and now to Libya. So there has certainly been a sort of domino effect. There are common threads, and those common threads are the following. First, a lack of job opportunity and economic opportunity in these countries. Second, a repressive rule for decades. Colonel Gaddafi has been in power for longer than any other single civilian ruler in the world, 41 years. And that stagnation, that lack of expression, the inability for any democratic institutions or alternative institutions to flourish in many of these countries is another common thread. Third, there is a new, younger generation in these countries. Almost half the population in the Arab world is under 30 years old. And many of these young people are well educated. They're connected by social media like Twitter and Facebook, which have played a major role in each of these revolts. Now, you can't put a rubber stamp on each of them and say they're identical. Those are common threads. There are differences. For example, in Bahrain, it's the majority Shiite population feeling rightly or wrongly that they've been discriminated against by the Sunni-led government. Yemen is a case in point where you have many of those common threads, but where you have a government that's been weak for a very long time, that doesn't control its own country and therefore is ripe for this. So there are common threads, but there are also differences. And let me say, if I may, one major difference between Egypt and Libya, and it's very important, I think, to appreciate. In Egypt, for all of the problems that Mubarak had, you do have significant growth. There was a growing middle class, and there is a uniform national military, a stabilizing force. Gaddafi, in effect, eliminated any institution on a national level, including the military. The military is broken up into battalions controlled by his sons and other loyalists. There's no unified command. There is basically no national institution. Again, even in Egypt, you have the Muslim Brotherhood, for better or for worse, as a national institution. There are simply, literally no national institutions, democratic, Islamic, or military, in Libya.
Part of the problems in the Middle East is the economic situation in many countries, like for example, in Egypt, we can say. But this unrest will lead to more economic difficulties. Do you expect that to lead to more unrest and more instability in the region?
Well, there's no question that when you have a revolution and banks are shut down, businesses are boarded up, people can't buy necessary goods, that's going to lead to short-term pain economically and aggravate the problem. However, I think the people who have started these revolutions recognize that unless you break through the long-term dictatorial rulers, unless you create a more open economy and a more open society, you're not going to get the kind of job opportunity and economic growth that will be necessary. So there is some short-term pain associated with these revolutions and upheavals, for sure. But I think that it will lead, if they are channeled properly, into longer-term gain. Permit me to say, however, that with all revolutions, going back to the French Revolution, there is never a guarantee. The revolution in communist China, the 1917 revolution with Lenin. Revolutions don't always turn out the way one thought. French Revolution ultimately led to a democratic France, but only after many decades. There were several other revolutions. There was the Napoleonic military period. So when you disturb an established order, however dictatorial and unfair that order is, there's always a difficult transition period under the best of circumstances, and that will certainly translate into more difficulties economically.
How much the United States will be able to help the economic growth in those countries, especially economic here is still unstable?
Even at a time of great budget austerity in the United States, I believe there will be bipartisan support among Democrats and the new Republican leadership in the House that economic assistance, training are absolutely essential to solidify the democratic forces in these countries and to make sure that these revolutions don't slide into chaos and lead perhaps to a military takeover, to radical Islamists filling the void left by the absence of the dictators. I really think that there will be a commitment to significant economic aid and economic development. But even that will take time. It doesn't immediately flow to people. There'll be a restlessness about where's the aid, where's the assistance, I don't see it. So it will be there, but it won't appear overnight to be helping people. And so during this transition period, there's going to have to be an element of patience on the part of those opponents who have ignited this democratic revolution, which is very exciting and has great prospects. But if there's not a patience level, then the void created by the absence of these dictators, by toppling the dictators, could be filled by the worst elements of society, and things will be even worse than they were under the dictators, many of whom were, after all, pro-Western and pro-American in their orientation.
Ambassador Eizenstat, let me ask you here, the United States doesn't want to force the no-fly zone over Libya. Do you think the reason is a political or economical reason?
Well, I think there's good reason, at least at this point, not to try to enact and implement a no-fly zone. Number one, the United Nations hasn't sanctioned that. Number two, the Arab League hasn't sanctioned that. Number three, if we go in alone unilaterally or with NATO force, then it will look like potentially another Iraq all over again. The U.S. coming in, the West coming in and trying to have its hand over the Middle East and over Arab countries. And if you ask, again, your earlier question about common threads, one common thread is these countries were all, in one way or another, controlled by outside forces, whether it was the Ottoman Empire, the Crusaders, or more recently, colonial powers, the British and the French and the Italians. So the notion of coming back in with an American or NATO force for a no-fly zone may simply reignite that history of foreign interventionism. And last, a no-fly zone is not as easy as it appears. You've first got to knock out air defense systems. There's a potential for collateral damage of innocent civilians. We're not sure exactly what the nature of the opposition is that's calling for them. So there may be other ways, perhaps airdropping in equipment that is not so sophisticated that it could pass into terrorist hands, but could be used to help the opponents fight the Gaddafi forces.
فاصل قصير نعود بعده لمواصلة الحوار مع السفير ستيوارت ايزنستات الشريك في كوفينغتون اند بيرلينغ. ابقوا معنا. أهلا ومرحبا بكم مرة أخرى. Ambassador Eizenstat, there is a question about why other countries did not have this unrest, like, for example, Syria, and then I want to talk about Saudi Arabia.
Well, first of all, Iran did have unrest. Of course, they had it after the June 2009 election frauds, where the whole Green Opposition Party and movement really took hold. And more recently, in reaction to the cascading events in Tunisia and Egypt and elsewhere in the region, that opposition, weakened by repression by the Revolutionary Guards and the regime, did come out again. Now, with respect to Syria, there was a modest statement by some people in opposition, but in Syria, the Ba'ath Party has such an absolutely iron control over the country that it has been more difficult for any opposition, which has been wiped out largely, to really give voice. So I wouldn't preclude the fact that there will be something in Syria, but I think that their very rigid control, their very repressive security forces, and the fear in the public that if they raise their heads they'll be automatically killed or tortured, has prevented that. Let's remember that in Libya, where you also, of course, had a very repressive regime, Libya was in effect three countries in 3 different regions of what we now know as modern-day Libya until the 1930s. It's only been reunited relatively recently. And the incidents that occurred in Benghazi involved the family that had been repressed by Gaddafi in 1996. So you had areas of the country which already had nascent opposition, which you don't have in Syria.
Ambassador Eizenstat, what about Saudi Arabia? Do you think the injections of billions of dollars in the Saudi market and for the Saudi citizens will protect Saudi Arabia from unrest?
Well, I don't think it's only the recent injection of cash that King Abdullah came back from his sick leave to provide. It is the fact that first, the monarchy there is very respected. It's been in existence since the early part of the 20th century, 1902. The House of Saud is very well respected. It has very deep roots. Number 2, King Abdullah himself has been a reformist. He's creating the new economic cities to provide job opportunities. The King Abdullah Science and Technology University allows co-ed education, Western education. There is the beginning of economic reform. So the question is whether those have come in quickly enough. I hope that they have. And I think that the prospect for their younger population of better opportunities is certainly there. Also, it's a very wealthy country because they are the largest oil exporter and the second largest producer. And as I mentioned at the beginning in answer to your first question on common threads, one common thread that has tied together what otherwise would be very different countries is the lack of job opportunities, the lack of economic opportunity, the endemic poverty. You don't tend to have that in Saudi Arabia because of its oil wealth, and now more recently, as they've begun to diversify their economy, they're creating more job opportunities.
Ambassador Eizenstat, how this unrest in the Middle East will affect the global economy, who is already suffering from a lot of problems?
Clearly, the roiling of the waters in the Middle East, these dramatic upheavals affecting key oil-producing countries. Libya is not huge, but they're about the 17th largest. And the prospect that Bahrain and Saudi Arabia may come into play, I don't think, again, that Saudi Arabia will, and I don't think that the royal family in Bahrain will be toppled. But the prospect, the fear that this may occur has driven oil prices up to over $100 a barrel. Most economists believe that $100 a barrel oil, if sustained for the next 2 or 3 months, could have a significant negative impact on world growth and on U.S. GDP growth, perhaps as much as 0.5% or even 1%. The way to look at this is that every $10 increase in the price of oil per barrel increases gasoline prices at the pump about 25 cents a gallon and takes out about 0.25% of growth if sustained over several months period. So if there is a cloud on what otherwise is a brightening economic horizon in the United States, as we're finally getting some traction, it is the prospect that oil prices will continue to be very high, and that takes purchasing power out of the hands of consumers. Instead of buying a new car, buying clothes, buying a new washing machine, buying other goods, they're having to put that extra money into gasoline. But in addition, it creates yet another factor that can't be exactly quantified, and that is uncertainty. Businesses hate uncertainty, and consumers hate uncertainty. Not knowing how far energy prices will be driven up and for how long simply encourages consumers and businesses to pull back on the investment, on the purchase, and wait until there's a clearer signal of what's going to happen. And that uncertainty is itself the enemy of economic growth and prosperity.
Ambassador Eizenstat, do you expect the situation in Algeria and in Jordan and Morocco? We saw some demos there. Do you expect the situation to improve and or to develop an unrest or a revolution?
I do not. I think that the king in Jordan, who I've met and I have a great respect for, has already removed his prime minister. He's put in new economic reforms. He's tried to reform the economic system even further. So I don't see that happening. I think that in countries like Egypt and Tunisia, there is going to have to be a need for patience, because when the established order collapses, it takes time to put a transition into effect that will lead to free and fair elections, that will allow parties to organize and to have a clear agenda, to set up election machinery, and even more broadly, to establish what we call the rule of law, respect for law, respect for precedent, creating an independent, non-political judiciary. These are all institutions which didn't exist or existed only in very elementary forms in many of these countries, and it will take years to produce them. So we're in a very difficult transition period to what I think will be, I genuinely think will be, an exciting, new, creative, more democratic, more open Middle East. The question is, how long will it take to get there, and will negative forces like radical Islamists or another military regime fill this void during this period of uncertainty and transition? One hopes not. I think in Egypt the military has played a very constructive role in laying the foundation for a democracy. In Libya, we don't have that national military establishment to permit a transition. And so there's a real prospect, as we're seeing now, of in effect a civil war and a very chaotic transition period if and when, and I think the question is not if but when Gaddafi leaves, but who will fill that void? And right now there really are, again, no national institutions as there are with the military in Egypt and in Tunisia.
Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, thank you for your time. بهذا تنتهي هذه الحلقة من البرنامج. قدمناها لحضراتكم من ناسداك، وكان معنا السفير ستيوارت ايزنستات الشريك في كوفينغتون اند بيرلينغ. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء الأسبوع القادم.